Hi, friends. Welcome again to Beyond the Clouds Edge to Edge Transformation. It's a joy for me to talk to a number of people. I'm Shankar Hemadi of Blue Horizons. And Shekar is somebody I've admired through the decades. Please tell us a little bit about you, Shekar, what you've been up to, and anything you want to share.
Great. Hey, thanks, Shankar. And Shankar and I have known each other, as he described, for now probably close to 40 years or something since our early days at IIT Bombay. So it's been a delightful journey for both of us. Just quickly in my background, so I am now the CEO of a company called Arrcus that's based here in Silicon Valley in the Bay Area, just next to San Jose Airport. We are in the space of networking. We're out here to disrupt networking the way it's delivered by traditional incumbents like Cisco, Juniper, Arista, etc. I've been here for about a year and a half. Prior to this, I was at VMware for 14 years, doing two things. For a good part of that time, I was actually running our M&A, investments, corporate strategy as part of the CEO's team. And then for the last 4 years, I was the general manager running a business unit focused on telecom and edge cloud computing. And then prior to that, I've had stints at a few other startups. What I wanted to actually focus our discussion now, Shankar, was just in terms of the infrastructure evolution. I actually think fundamentally we are sitting at an inflection point where a certain set of trends are just fortuitously coming together. And it's almost like bringing together this perfect storm of infrastructure trends that enables us to now do things for the future in a way which is very different from the way things have been done in the past. So three in particular that I want to focus on, because they are more pertinent to also what we do here at Arrcus, is one is the move to 5G. So a lot of people talk about the communications infrastructure. And of course, if you look globally, there are still parts of the globe that are operating on 2G and 3G, even as we talk about like the fifth generation of mobile wireless networks. But overall, I would say the move to 5G is going to enable even places like Africa and parts of Southeast Asia that have historically not been as advanced, perhaps technologically, to now leapfrog and essentially get an even playing field almost in terms of what they can do from a communications infrastructure standpoint. So fundamentally, I'm a believer that the world at large is going to move to this 5G or 5G plus communications infrastructure before too long. The second trend that I wanted to actually point out is what is happening in terms of cloud computing. So almost everybody now is aware of what is happening in cloud computing. Most startups will actually be native on the cloud. They don't really build their own infrastructure. But the pendulum is now swinging back to a point where you now have all these large hyperscaler clouds. I mean, likes of Google, Amazon, Azure. And what they are all now looking for is they're basically saying, how do we now go from, or customers are saying, how do we go from dependence on a single cloud to having multiple clouds that can service us? So this concept is now called multi-cloud. And so most of the dialogue that you are now likely to see over the next decade is not about, oh, are you using the cloud? It's more about how are you using more than one cloud? And what does that mean in terms of how your infrastructure is supporting that move to a multi-cloud universe? The third important aspect of this, or the third pillar here, is edge computing. So for those of you that aren't familiar with edge computing, it's the notion that rather than having everything happen in consolidated data centers in a few points around the globe, you can have a number of technical decision-making happen at the endpoints or at the edges of the network, if you will. So this edge could be a car. This edge could be a branch of a bank. This edge could be the central office or the base station of a telecom carrier. This edge could be a head end of a cable provider. So there are different points that are sort of the extensions of your core that become these points at the edges where compute, network, storage, etc., infrastructure can pop up and then enable you to make decisions at points that are closer to where you want to be, as opposed to going all the way, which is basically like hundreds or thousands of miles back to a centralized data center. So if you take these three trends, if you take the trend of what is happening in 5G, if you take the trend of what is happening in multi-cloud networking, as well as edge computing, there's no real reason why all three had to happen together and why all three had to happen now. But the fact that they're happening together and they're happening now is what I think we should all capitalize on. So why is this so important? This is so important because the kinds of applications that you and I are used to that were built in the last decade or two, all of them were reliant on more static infrastructure that had whatever 2G, 3G kind of capability in the communications network, that had one cloud or no cloud that it was reliant on from a cloud computing standpoint, and where all of the instructions had to go all the way back to some consolidated point in the data center before actions could be taken, right? So here we are now where all these trends are coming together. And therefore, I think it is imperative that everybody recognizes that when you build your infrastructure, when you're leveraging that from the standpoint of what it is that you are doing in terms of creating and deploying new applications, and those applications could be consumer applications like gaming. Those applications could be enterprise applications like network security or connectivity, or just productivity applications that are delivered. Any of these things are going to be much more efficient, performant, and accessible because of the combination of these trends that are coming together, right? So that's why I wanted to make sure that everybody started getting grounded on these trends. You asked your questions internally as well as to your external providers on, okay, how are you leveraging 5G? How are you leveraging multi-cloud networking? How are you leveraging edge computing? But I think this is just a fascinating time for us all to be in this infrastructure space, Shankar. So let me pause here and see if you have any other questions to add. So.
Well, that's a very short but good way of introducing the whole space. I didn't think of that the three of these trends could have been, they didn't have to coincide, but they are, and we're using it. So my question is, do we have the people to be able to make all this happen? Because it requires deep expertise in all these areas. And if we don't have, then how do we make it happen? Let's say you are the CEO of an oil company, oil exploration. How would you go about, where do you begin?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, first of all, I would say that alongside everything I've described, there's a level of automation that kind of embeds itself into this thing. So the requirements of what people do are constantly changing. Okay, so you needed at a point where you had a pretty large static infrastructure environment, you had to have a number of people that were essentially server administrators, or they were administrators of certain points in the infrastructure and certain boxes. So all that changes now to people that know software and that can write code, etc. In this next generation, with AI becoming a very big part of everything we do, there's a ton of like artificial intelligence that creeps in terms of how automation can come in even into network infrastructure or compute infrastructure. So what does all that mean? All that means is that the efficiency that these architectures are going to lead to for customers, and let's take a large oil company as an example, they are going to be tremendously useful in making sure that they don't actually need as many people to go and manage and deploy and create applications on this environment that compared to what they did before. But equally, it also means that people need to upskill themselves so that the same people can now do something that is, I mean, or maybe it's not the same people, but as the generations evolve, the new workforce should actually be working on problems that are whatever 2 or 3 orders of magnitude more complex than what the older generation was working on. because many of the older generations problems are now solved through automation or AI or something that then gets built into this infrastructure. Now, take an example, once again, as you pointed out, of a large oil company. A large oil company today, if they have rigs, those rigs could actually be monitored automatically. You have drones that can go in and land or kind of hover over and have good visual ability to go and decide what is happening on those oil rigs. The infrastructure, once again, like I said, could have things like private 5G and wireless that is deployed on just that one oil rig. You could have a combination of cloud and edge computing, like I described, that enables the network of multiple oil rigs to all be connected. So this gives you a sense of almost like a utopian reality where somebody is sitting there and then kind of mining these oil rigs all across the globe, but they're all being done remotely. They're all being done through software, and they're all being managed through a combination of things like drones and robotics and so on. And this is all a reality today. Okay, this is no longer a dream. This is no longer somebody's vision of the future. These technologies are available right now, and that just simplifies greatly the ability for somebody like even a large oil company in terms of how they're going to manage their infrastructure. Now, on the other hand, though, it does take an effort on their part to go in and say, here is how we're going to deploy the latest, greatest technology infrastructure into our data centers, into our network, on our rigs. And then it also takes an effort for them to go in and say, therefore, now our human personnel that we deploy and employ inside our company, this is what they're going to focus on, as opposed to maybe some of the tasks that they were doing in the last decade.
I know the world is changing so fast. It's hard even to catch up. When I took a 6-year break from the hardware industry, it took me a year to really catch up. I can imagine what must be happening in remote edges of the cloud. Do you have any use cases you can talk about where you have seen a major transformation at the company or in that industry, either currently at Arrcus or earlier when you were at VMware? Have you seen major transformations happening, and what do you foresee will happen going forward?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things here, right? One is the whole pandemic, undesirable as it was, it certainly kind of propagated a new notion of what does work from anywhere mean. And so as a result, I think that's a very good classic use case for saying today, a lot of people take for granted, I mean, including this call that we are on, that you can get work done from wherever you are, right? And so I think the ball is in motion in terms of making that a reality. And so you literally should be able to work whether you're vacationing in Hawaii, or hopefully not working while you're on vacation, but whether you're in Hawaii or whether you're on an oil rig or whether you're in the air. And while some of these things, of course, have been propagated well by the effect of countering the pandemic, there are other things that haven't moved quite as fast, right? I mean, even today, honestly, if I go down 280 from San Francisco Airport down to South Bay, there are parts where I don't get any cellular connectivity, or I can't even just kind of place an audio call on the phone. And that looks almost like 3 decades back. We all expect Wi-Fi and connectivity everywhere. And then there are still places where that is, in fact, not a reality. So I think the reason I wanted to point that out is in some areas, we are actually quite well advanced, and there are technologies available that can help us do great things for the future. There are other things or other areas of technology where even basic problems still need some solving, like just basic coverage issues using cellular telephony so that you can place a simple audio call and get connectivity. So I do think that we have to not get too far ahead of ourselves. We need to make sure that simple applications are served, even as people are conjuring up. Like the metaverse is a classic, like next generation thing that if it works, I think there are so many positive ways in which you could deploy that. You could bring I don't know, travel to remote parts of the world where people just don't have resources to go and visit these great locations, or you could bring education in a very real way to students that otherwise cannot afford that. These are all examples of where you can take the metaverse. But like I said, we need to make sure that basic subsistence, connectivity, things like that, and even resources like electricity and water are available and accessible globally, even as we are dreaming of the reality of these next generation applications. So I think both kinds of things exist, and we need to make sure that we are serving well on not just the next generation front end cutting edge stuff, but also on the basic survival stuff. So.
Yeah, Shekar, you bring up a very interesting point. We know that the digital divide seems to be growing. Do you see that going forward with all these new technologies? Will the digital divide get worse? Or are there ways, scenarios in which actually more and more people will be able to utilize and therefore will not get disenfranchised when it comes to using these technologies?
Yeah, I'm much more an optimistic believer of the latter, Shankar, which is I think that it will absolutely lead to better connectivity and in fact, hopefully not actually have a divide where you can have like different I mean, some of the examples for are there are parts of the world that are much more advanced than the United States in mobile payments, as an example. Okay. And the reason that that is true is because it's almost like necessity in parts of the world where they have not had other forms of things like credit cards and banking institutions affording large amounts of credit. And so they've not really had that. And so mobile payments had become the way of the future for them. And they've done a really good job of perfecting their infrastructure to enable that. So I actually think that digitization will cause people to realize that they can cover their gaps in more creative ways than they did before, and therefore almost normalize some of these deltas that exist between the haves and the have-nots. And hopefully, now it of course does take some visionaries, some people to take that and say, look, we're going to take this as a cause and go make it happen. Like rural connectivity is a great example, right? There is a cost to rural connectivity. Somebody has to put a tower somewhere there and make sure that that's serviced. So I think governments need to focus on how they are going to potentially subsidize or support the mobile industry in order to enable rural connectivity to happen. But I have a feeling like once you get that in there, it's like a lifeline for rural areas to start developing, build out infrastructure, become a much more front and center part of the economy. And in a place like India, for example, reduce the possibility that farmers are going to get exploited or artisans in villages are going to get exploited, because they're all going to be essentially selling their wares on a global market, as opposed to having to go through like many middlemen or channels. So therefore, I'm saying, look, a basic level of utility, connectivity, water, power, etc., is a requirement. But as long as you make that happen, there is going to be no real divide here. So.
That's wonderful to hear, because we've needed that for a while. Growing up, I remember when we were in college, we learned things and there were no computers. There was no real, connectivity. And we learned it theoretically. And then now things are happening where students, even in remote parts, are able to use it. We could continue talking all day long. There's so much wisdom and so many experiences you've had. I would love to talk, but maybe we'll do that another time.
Yes, look forward. Thank you for having me on this, Shankar.